Hi, this is Bob Wells here, and welcome to Undercurrent Stories. This is the show where we uncover some fascinating stories from people about their interests. In today's show, we hear from Amanda Jenkins, who's had a lifelong passion for the protection of wildlife and biodiversity. As well as hearing about the work of the Wildlife Trust here in the UK, Amanda explains how each of us can play our part in helping to restore the natural environment. I hope you enjoy the show. Hello, Amanda.
Hello, Bob.
Welcome to the show, Amanda, and thank you very much for coming on the show to talk about such an important subject.
Thank you for inviting me.
Before we talk about the work that you're doing, Amanda, can you tell us a little bit about your background, please? How did you get into conservation? What sort of roles did you have before joining the Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust?
I'm a farmer's daughter from Yorkshire, actually, and I've always been interested in wildlife. But I think when I was growing up on a farm with access to fields and hedgerows and streams and ditches, I actually took it for granted. And I think now that I have moved away from, being at home and having all that access, I think I appreciate it a lot more. So I think, I just love the changing of the seasons and watching the world wake up. And this is such a wonderful time of year in South Lincolnshire. The hedgerows have become a little bit greener. We've got hawthorn or may blossom out. We watch leaves unfurling, and then the summer comes and we see road verges and meadows with buttercups and wildflowers, and sort of swift screeching overhead are always the sound of summer to me. So, that was my background growing up, and we have less access to that. If we don't grow up on a farm, we might have less access to that. And so when I actually, much to my father's chagrin, I married an RAF pilot. And I didn't marry the neighbouring farmer's son, which I think my dad was hoping for. And I kind of missed that. So we've moved around the country, just this country, quite a bit. And I've missed that access to wildlife. And I think that kind of encouraged me to look to doing more work in sort of wildlife conservation and ecology as well, how the whole of the system of natural systems interact with each other. So I did a degree in ecology with De Montfort University. So I graduated in 2000. And then, and after that, I worked for the Farming Wildlife Advisory Group. So my degree and that sort of work combined my passion really for farming and wildlife.
It must be great. Yeah, it must be great to actually combine your passion and your love for protecting wildlife and the beauty of wildlife, and then actually having a job that does that.
Absolutely. I've been really fortunate that, it's worked out my way. I worked for the Environment Agency for 10 years in their conservation department, and I've worked for Natural England for a little while. But I found a very happy home with Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust.
Yeah, that's great.
So,
So just talking about, before we get into the detail about the local project that you've got, could you tell us a little bit about the Wildlife Trust on a national level?
Yes, certainly. The Wildlife Trust, so it's a Royal Society of Wildlife Trusts, is an umbrella organisation. And then within that, there are 46 individual wildlife trusts. And they're all formed in the same way, really, by active and motivated people getting together to make a difference, in the environment that they live in. They've all got an interest in wildlife and their natural environment. Each trust is an independent charity, but they all share the same vision, really, to make the landscape better, to join up the landscape, if you like, for wildlife, and to bring people closer to nature. And it's not just about land as well, it's about the sea, and we have marine protection zones. So we want to create a living landscape, if you like.
Oh, right. So you don't. It's not just the inner part of the countryside. It's also the coastline as well.
That's right. Yes, we go out to the tidal limit, which varies in different parts of Lincolnshire, or different parts of the country. Sorry, Lincolnshire is bordered by the Wash, Lincolnshire, and East Anglia, of course, the Norfolk coastline, and the Wash is an incredibly special area for wildlife, and it's got lots of designations, if you like, special protection areas for birds, special areas of conservation. It's a Ramsar site, which is an internationally important area of wetland It's a special scientific interest. It's got, the coast and the area around it, the marshes and the fens in Lincolnshire have lots of environmental designation that is really important to recognise.
So I know it's a question that's asked a lot, and most people have a great idea about what it is. But why is the conservation of wildlife and biodiversity so important, Amanda?
Well, if we look on an international level, really, just looking at what pollinators, so certain insects do for us, 1 in 3 mouthfuls of food we eat globally is pollinated by insects.
1 in 3?
1 in 3, that's right, yeah. So that's on a very basic level. And to look after the natural environment, we need to look after soil. So we need good quality, well-managed soils.
Yes.
Which grow our food. We need clean and we need plentiful water because we drink it and we wash in it and flush our loos with it. All that needs to be, good quality. And the air that we breathe needs to be good quality as well.
Yes.
So all that is dependent on how we manage our soils. And an awful lot of the work and water, and an awful lot of the work done by soils is sort of the ecology underneath the soil and within the soil, if you like. So It all starts from a very basic level. And if we look after our natural capital, land, water, air, we look after ourselves and we look after wildlife. We can combine the two. We can look after our natural environment and we can look after, us and wildlife as well. And we really need a kind of living landscape rather than just isolated sites of wildlife. So at the minute we have some fantastic nature reserves, and Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust manage about 100 nature reserves for wildlife and for people.
And are these nature reserves places where we can go and have a look?
Absolutely. All of the nature reserves, apart from one on our doorstep in Lincolnshire, which is Willow Fen, is closed at the minute, but all nature reserves are open for people. Some of them you're restricted to not taking dogs at sensitive times of year, but you can, as long as you keep your dog on a lead, you can walk your dog around a nature reserve. And some of these sites are extremely accessible. So some of those sites might be, in towns in Boston and in Spalding in South Lincolnshire. There are local nature reserves that people can easily access. Other sites you might need your bike to get to.
And are these nature reserves? Are they something that do you buy the land or do you lease it off somebody, or how does it work?
Most of them are owned by Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust.
Yes.
So we own the land and we manage it, and it means if we do own that land, we can manage it in a way for nature conservation that best suits that area.
Yes.
So, we own most of the nature reserves, but we also work in partnership with other landowners to connect, and land managers as well, to connect these nature reserves with the rest of the countryside. Yes. And when the Wildlife Trust and Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust is the same, we look at the biodiversity at a landscape scale. We can't just look at isolated nature reserves because they become islands and none of the nature can get out, and that's a threat to the natural, to the ecology and the wildlife on the site. So what we want to do is try and spread these reserves of nature, if you like, out into the wider countryside. Yeah. And we do this by working with farmers. So in South Lincolnshire, as part of the South Lincolnshire Fenlands Partnership, we work with farmers who have connected up their countryside stewardship schemes. So that might be managing hedges and field drains and margins, field margins. So they've connected their sites, their land, with nature reserves.
Is a field margin by the edge of a road, or is that just against a stream? Or
it could be to protect a stream, or it could be just around the edge of an arable field. So they're part of countryside stewardship schemes at the minute, and we are moving now into a new time. When we leave Europe, we are looking at what the next environmental schemes might be. So we're working with farmers as that new scheme comes through. So that will be environmental land management. And
Amanda, I've heard something about this nature recovery network. Can you tell us a bit about that, please?
Creating a nature recovery network is one of the aims of the Wildlife Trust, the Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust too. And I can send you a link to a paper that was produced for the government by the Royal Society of Wildlife Trusts. And Lincolnshire gets a mention. Lincolnshire roadside nature reserves get a mention in that. But the document really sets out that we all need nature.
Yes.
And it's very much, there've been extensive studies now, some of them by the Wildlife Trust and some of them by, people independent of nature conservation organisations who have looked at the health and well-being aspects of engaging with nature. So we all need nature. It's good for us. It helps to improve our mood. It helps us to exercise. And we're all better when our lives are a little bit wild, really.
That's very true, yeah.
Yeah, and really creating a nature recovery network is one of the ambitions of the Wildlife Trust. And that is we have gardens. We've got about 430,000 hectares of garden across the countryside. We've got 250,000 miles of roads and the green areas beside those roads. We've got housing developments and we've got parks and amenity areas, and all of these places could be improved for wildlife. And some areas are doing a great job. So, for example, if we look at roadside nature reserves, the Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust have done a kind of extensive 6-year survey working with local volunteers and people. So we don't own the roadside nature reserves, but what we do is we look at and see what's there, and we look how we can manage them positively. And some of the plants that are found on roadside nature reserves are only found within nature reserves elsewhere. So it shows that these linkages, this sort of nature network across the county is really crucial to biodiversity. Yes. It looks very nice when we're driving alongside it, but it's also very good for wildlife as well. And if we look at South Lincolnshire, we have extensive rivers and drains that have got a wealth of wildlife in them, and some of those are designated as internationally designated as special areas of conservation. But at a local level, we've got species in drains that you would just drive past and not think any more of. We've got, fantastic wealth of biodiversity in our fenland drain system, some of the best in the county and in the country as well. So these areas are all connected and they run through our landscape. And that's what the idea of creating a nature recovery network is. So it's working with highways, it's working with local authorities when they're giving their planning permissions for new developments, be that housing or commercial or industrial developments. It's looking at, out into the sea. So we talk about marine protection zones. So we need a nature recovery network on land of interconnected habitats. And we need a nature recovery network out into the sea. So when we have developments in the wash, those might be wind farms, it might be types of fishery, it might be cabling to connect to wind farms. All these things need to be properly assessed to make sure that they're not doing any damage to the environment. And if they are, that is mitigated and that made good. And that we're also, whilst we're doing those things, we want to be creating a net gain in biodiversity.
So just to ask a question about the Nature Recovery Network, you mentioned about the banding of the areas. Does that mean, in effect, that we're looking for, or you're looking for, a joined up, almost nature band right across the country?
Yes, absolutely.
With no gaps.
Well, the best that we can do, and if we look at our gardens can be a little bit wild, and I'll send some links through to the Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust's Action for Insects campaign, and I'll send you the nature recovery strategy as well. So it's a case of linking up, and not just within Lincolnshire. We're working, so Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust are working a little bit with the Landite Trust, and RSPB, as well as we go down through the county and into Norfolk and Cambridgeshire. We have a Fens for the Future partnership, which looks at the fenland habitat. So we're in South Lincolnshire. We are in a Fens character area. So it's how that fenland can join up. We've got a lot of wetland drains that the internal drainage boards manage exceedingly well for the most part, and they work with nature conservation organisations to do that. So it's about joining things up. Oh, that's a jet.
Is that a military aircraft? How just have to explain for listeners. We are in the middle of Lincolnshire,
yes.
and we're not far away from various airfields. So
I think that's probably a Eurofighter going over. I must apologise.
Yeah. I'm not sure what damage that does to the wildlife.
Well, it can cause a bit of disturbance on fenland reserves, but we have to be very careful that we don't.
I guess all the animals are fairly used to it now.
Absolutely, yes.
They grow up with it.
Absolutely, yes. It does. They do get used to a bit of disturbance. That's right.
Yes. Yeah. And you mentioned a bit earlier on about some of the rare animals, and not just animals but biodiversity. Can you sort of give listeners any ideas of the names of some of these birds or animals?
Gosh, yes. Well, I mean, it all starts out, the ecology is really important. So we talked about why nature's important, and that sort of natural capital, so land, air and water, and how they combine. So in different areas, in the chalk uplands, for example, and I actually live in the chalk uplands that leads down to the fen. So you'll get different species interacting, so you get different rare species. If you go down into the fens, where in South Lincolnshire we're talking about the sort of a wetter habitat, and some of the species that are in the rivers and drains. Well, there's a special area of conservation at Baston Fen, that's an internationally designated site for a fish called a spined loach.
Spined roach.
Loach, Loach, yeah. So that's a rare species of fish that's confined to lowland rivers. So that's quite unique. Some of the kind of commoner plants that you will see in the fens are, we all know what reeds look like, and bulrushes. We've all watched Wind in the Willows. So we get a lot more of those common species, and then there are similar species of sort of water plants. There's a ribbon-leaved water plantain that is in South Lincolnshire that is only in one other place in the country. It's called Alisma. It's called I can't remember its English name, but it's called Alisma graminium, and that is critically endangered. So we find species like that, and then we find the commoner species like reed. All these species interact, if you like, and the gravel area in South Lincolnshire percolates water through it, so the water is very clean and good as it runs through the area. And that in itself brings sort of a greater diversity of species. And then because those plants are there, certain insects will be there, so we have certain rare fenland diving beetles on certain sites. And I look at some of these things. I am always amazed by people who are very good at insect spotting, because I look at them and I don't know what they are, and then you bring an expert in and he'll say, well, that's a greater fenland diving beetle. So there's some really rare plants, and then on top of those plants some insects, but you need the clean water, you need good soil at the base of that to make sure that this wildlife can survive and thrive. Sure. And then we look at the sort of larger, so we have kingfishers down in the South Lincolnshire fens.
So there are still kingfishers?
Oh yes, gosh, you walk along the River Welland, and you'll see kingfishers quite often. They do like shadier banks, so where there's fewer trees, you might see fewer of them. Yeah. But we've also got birds, and we had a bird that came to Willow Tree Fen in 2017 called the bluethroat. Now that had come from colder climes, if you like, in February. It was blown off course, but this is a really rare bird. 11,000 people came to see it in the space of 7 weeks because it was such a rarity.
11,000 people came to see one bird.
One tiny bird that looks a bit like a rock. It was very pretty. Yeah. And we have other species that have dropped in, like a glossy ibis and white. So we get lots of little egret now, but and they have come in over the last sort of 10 or 20 years, and now we're getting other species coming into South Lincolnshire, like cattle egrets. And certainly they always say, don't they, if you build it, it will come. And if you build these sort of bigger areas for wildlife and then you connect them up through the landscape, you will get bigger iconic species like bittern and common crane and all these larger species which are coming. They're flying over South Lincolnshire. People have heard bittern booming in the Fenland gravel pits. So these birds are the bigger iconic birds and mammals. I was sat on a nature reserve the other day and I saw a water vole swim across the channel. Really? And these were plentiful when we were all, when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s. They were plentiful, but now, they're becoming endangered in other parts of the country. So if we look after our habitats and species, these birds will come, and animals and insects will come. Yeah. And it's also really good for the local economy because people come to see these things. People want to walk in nature.
Yeah. So in terms of where we are at the moment, and I guess probably talking about Lincolnshire at the moment, but it could be national, are we stationary in terms of redressing the issues with wildlife, or are we going backwards, or are we starting to make progress?
Well, there was a State of Nature report in 2019. So that was by by conservation organisations, which they produced this report for the government. And that was over 8,000. So it was about 8,500 species surveyed. Yeah. 1 in 7 of those are at risk of extinction. So that's not great, really, is it? When you look at it. So there is always so much more we can do, and lots of legislation has led to a reduction in the decline, if you like. But we always have to be vigilant, and we can't be the only people. Nature conservation organisations aren't the only people who can or who do look after our natural environment. Local farmers are very good. We work with internal drainage boards as well. We work with Natural England and the Environment Agency, and all these organisations, as part of their remit, have duties for nature conservation, for biodiversity. Yeah. We could actually do better because, planning applications, when they come in, we assess planning applications for larger developments, and too many times there are developers who are very good at providing for nature. But if we look at a development, a lot of it is short amenity, very closely mown grassland, gardens and footpaths, and all these areas could be so much better for wildlife and with less cost as well.
You're working well with farmers, with the gravel people, with the water people and all the rest of it. But you mentioned earlier on in our conversation about the amount of hectares of gardens that we've got in the country, which could go some way towards helping this. So for listeners who've got a garden and can try to do something, can you give us any examples of what they could try and do?
Yes, certainly. So if I will send you links to our website. If you go to Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust website, in June we have 30 Days Wild, which is more for families, I guess. What they can do. So it might be things like going to visit a local nature reserve, or it might be creating a pond in your garden, or even just going out and seeing what wildlife you might be able to see on the plants that you've got already in your garden, and which plants have got the most bees on, for example. And then you can enhance that. So we've also got Stay Wild at Home, which during the current sort of health situation, when we're not allowed to go out quite so much, we can enjoy nature in our back gardens just by letting a little bit of it go wild. So a tiny area of nettles at the back of a hedge. You can create a wildlife pond. It talks you through how to do that. What plants you plant, and this is for the big children as well as the little children. The Royal Horticultural Society, working with the Wildlife Trust, has got a fantastic pollinator. So plants that are good for pollinators. So be they garden plants or native wildlife species, we can all do a bit. We can all let a little area overgrow. We can create a log pile. We can put up bug hotels, nest boxes for birds. So there's so much that we can all do. And
Yes.
I mean, it's an absolute joy as well to do it, and it helps people to engage with nature
And for
to
ideas
relax.
for ideas about plants, that's all available on the website, both on the Lincolnshire one and the National Wildlife Trust.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, there's an Action for Insects campaign that you can sign up to as well. So that's part of the Wildlife Trust campaign. So we've got Stay Wild at Home on Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust pages, and there's a Facebook page as well where younger listeners and families can earn hedgehog reward points for things that they do for nature.
Well, I'd read about some guy who'd actually put a hole underneath his fence so that a hedgehog could go next door and travel across the garden. Is that something worth doing?
Absolutely. So if you can create a 13 centimetre hole between you and your neighbour, you'll allow hedgehogs to pass through. So this means that they don't have to walk on the road. And, we've all seen, even in the village that I live in, which is very quiet, we've all seen hedgehogs, that have met their demise on the road. So if you can create a little tunnel between your garden and the next, then you've created more space for wildlife, and they're fairly good at looking after themselves,
I mean, that's not much to do, is it? 130, that's just over 5 inches.
Yeah, tiny holes. So have a go, see what's there, and do a bit for wildlife and enjoy it. Sit back and enjoy it.
That's great. So you mentioned earlier on about some of the work you were doing with some of the larger organisations. Can you tell us a bit about the companies that take up the gravel? And because obviously afterwards you're left with a big gaping hole in the ground. That's
right. Yes, extracting sand and gravel is really important. Building houses is really important. We don't want to object to any of these things at the Wildlife Trust. What we want to do is work with organisations like the minerals companies to make the site better for wildlife when they leave it. So they have to submit a restoration plan. Yes. So in the past, we have worked with gravel companies in the fenland area to put a bit of fenland restoration into gravel pits, and that's been really, really sort of fruitful. So we have some areas. So historically, there were a lot of trees put around gravel sites, and that isn't necessarily good for wildlife because trees produce leaves that fall off in the autumn and winter, and over the years, this builds up nutrients in the ponds. And some of the species that in the fens, the restored areas were good for to start with, have lost their biodiversity because trees have dropped their leaves into there.
Well, I have to say that's something that I wouldn't have thought of.
No, well,
I would have thought trees would have been a great idea.
Also, trees attract things like crows and magpies, corvid species, and when you've got ducks and ducklings and water birds swimming, you're creating a kind of buffet for these corvids to come.
So I guess what you're saying is that trees have their place, quite rightfully, and we need them, but not necessarily right next to a lake.
That's right. So gravel areas, because they've got a very low water table, they always restore, if you like, to water, and sometimes this has to be pumped, otherwise there's too much of it. So what we do working with gravel companies is to suggest different ways of restoration that were more in keeping with a fenland habitat. And when we look at the fens as well, and we mentioned trees are fantastic. So restoration for wildlife and for people is all about the right measures in the right places. And trees are wonderful. They produce their own habitat. Woodlands are great. They keep, they're good for absorbing carbon dioxide, if you like. But in the fens, we have some incredible peatland soil. So restoration, we need to think about what restoration we're doing where. And restoration in the fenlands should be about conserving peat, and that helps to mitigate the effects of climate change. And as it degrades, so through previous intensive farming practices, as those areas, as those areas have been farmed, they have lost carbon, and that adds to the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So when mineral companies are looking at what they're restoring, and when farmers are looking at how they farm, what they do and how they manage the land and the restoration of the land has a big impact on natural capital, so that's the water, the air and the soil, and it also has an impact on wildlife as well. So so restoration, we deal really with the restoration of gravel sites and how the gravel companies work through their operations to make sure that it's good for biodiversity as they're working through it, and it's restored for the benefit of people and wildlife. And access to green space is really important for people, and we can some of our gravel reserves could be more open to local people who have to suffer the inconvenience of the restoration work to start.
And this is a good segue actually, because I'd really like to talk about what the actual project you're doing in a village in South Lincolnshire by the name of Baston.
Yes.
And which is actually next door to quite a lot of gravel pits,
absolutely, yes, that's right, yes. It started with a simple email really out to some of our parish council partners, because I work for the South Lincolnshire, or did work for the South Lincolnshire Fenlands Partnership, which is a project to help restore wetland and fenland in South Lincolnshire. And so we work with farmers, we work with range boards, we also work with communities, and a bit like what you can do in your garden, really. So what can we do in our village was kind of the ask. So at Willow Tree Fen Nature Reserve, we created a wildlife garden, which consisted of a large bug hotel, a pond, some meadow grassland, and some log piles. So the bug hotel was for insects, the meadowland was for the insects to feed on and to look nice as well, and the pond was for things like amphibians like frogs and toads and newts and things. And the log pile is somewhere for those things to go when they're not in the water, because the only amphibians and reptiles only spend a certain amount of time in water. So they go into these log piles and underneath bug hotels. And they distribute themselves, if you like, around your garden, let's say.
Yeah. Did you say bug hotel there?
I did, yes. So you can make them by gathering together a handful of canes, garden canes, wrapping them up with string and tucking them away in a tree or somewhere where they can insects can get access to. But the one that we build is a big one, so it's sort of 7 pallets high, and you put logs in it and pine cones in it, and all sorts of bits and pieces. So we did this at Willow Tree Fen with the hope that people might want to take that on board in their garden or maybe in their local village. So I asked parish councils if they were interested in creating a naturehood in a small community area. And Mayfield Gardens at Baston, which is an over 55s community, got in touch and said, we'd be interested. So they've created one of their areas they've created with garden varieties of plants like lavender, and it's a barbecue area, so they've put in some edible things like rosemary and sage and basil. Yes. So it's planting for insects in that particular area in a garden-like setting, but it's a communal area. And they built a lovely bug hotel. Mayfield Gardens were fantastic because they built this. They built 3 bug hotels now around the area, and they're more pollinator palace than bug hotel because they're so much better than the template that we gave them.
Pollinator palace.
A pollinator palace, yeah.
That's a nice description.
It is, yeah. They've done a fantastic job, and they want to do more as well. So they're learning how to create a small meadow area, for example. So this is how it all started, and then Baston School got in touch with us. And said, they would like to do something for wildlife. And many organisations, financially constituted bodies like parish councils or schools, can apply for this funding, and it's up to £500 for a community wildlife project. So the school did the same. The school did the same thing. And then we sort of got talking to other people. So there's a beekeeper who was really interested in, so she became involved. The parish council said, well, let's see what we can do with roadside nature reserves. The Plainfield Committee said the same thing. Another local school wanted to get involved. A local farmer who was farmed behind the school is really interested in what they can do to improve their strips around the edge of the village. So this is how Baston Nature had developed. And in the meantime, the parish council, someone from the parish council contacted me and said, what about looking at going carbon neutral. And there is a community in Ashton Hayes who have, for the last 15 years, been looking at reducing their carbon footprint to, if you like, combat the effects of climate change. We've had 2 community wildlife grants, and more organisations want to get involved to see how we can fit all these areas together. So a bit like like we described for hedgehogs, making holes under your hedges. How can we make our gardens better? How can we link those up? How can we link the road verges up? How can we manage the ditch system through the village better for wildlife? The church is also really keen to get involved. And they've got a churchyard and a cemetery. There's allotments there. So we're at the stage now where we have, before we were all restricted in our movements due to coronavirus, we managed to get some funding to have a community event where we looked at what people's vision might be in terms of going carbon neutral and going, creating a more wildlife-friendly village.
And obviously the lockdowns, halted that for the time being.
It has, yes. We've secured the funding, and hopefully, we can look to doing that when we're all allowed to physically socialise again. But there's so many ways that we can get, people who are housebound can join in just by, me taking along a pot with some soil and some seed in, or some plants, and growing a pot to put in your front garden or your back garden. We can all do, even if we have gardens that are tarmacked or decked out, we can all do that little bit. And it's how all those little bits join up in our garden, in our villages, across our road network, through our developments, through the countryside, and out across the country. So Baston Naturehood is just one example of how to create this nature recovery network.
Amanda, it's a wonderful story. Some of the stuff that you're doing at a top level with some of the big organisations and the farmers and everything is great. And also going right down to people in their own homes, how they can do stuff. So it's a great story, and it sounds like you're doing some brilliant work. So thank you ever so much for your time and coming on the show.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure. And just can I say that it's not just about us doing things, it's about everyone doing their bit. And part of our FENS partnership is to do with working with farmers and mineral companies and internal drainage boards and local planning authorities, right down to individuals.
No, that's great. And thanks very much for coming on.
Thank you.
My thanks go to today's guest, Amanda Jenkins, Conservation Officer from the Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I don't know about you, but I learned so much. Amanda has a tremendous knowledge of her subject. I think it brought home to me how much great work the Wildlife Trust and other conservation organisations are doing with farmers and landowners and others. However, for me, what I took away was what a great opportunity it is for all of us to play our part and get involved, whether that be in our gardens, balconies or even a window pot. We can all do something to help. If you would like to find out more on some of the practical steps that you can take to help wildlife, please see the show notes for details and links. You have been listening to Undercurrent Stories. I hope that you enjoyed the show. Please subscribe to the show for future episodes, and if you like what you hear, please share the show link with your friends and family. And if you have 60 seconds, I would be most grateful if you would please rate and review the show. Until next time, this is Bob Wells wishing you all the very best.